All right, we're recording.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Bryce McWilliams. I'm the Director of Theater Facilities at Tyler Junior College. That's in East Texas. And basically, I'm kind of a resident designer and facilities manager. I've been called the everything else guy. It just kind of depends on what the
Yeah.
show needs. I work a lot with our resident companies, so the dance department, the drill team, theater, obviously, and the music department.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's start from the beginning, Bryce. So, for you, what are some of your earliest memories of theater?
Wow. Okay. So I think my first memory is I saw a friend in a show that was actually a youth theater. So it was theater for not only for young audiences but for young performers, and they were in the show, and I said, "Hey, that's pretty cool." And so I started asking around and seeing, and I was in elementary school, I believe, and ended up getting cast as the farmer in a show about one of the many musicals that are written by elementary school directors. I
Yeah.
had one line, so I basically walked on with a pitchfork and said, "This barn is a mess. We need to clean it up." And that was it. That was my debut.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah. So I ended up doing several, youth theaters, and as I got into high school, I ended up merging more towards the tech side. My father was a carpenter. I worked summer jobs with him, so I already knew how to swing a hammer and use some power tools. And my director thought that was handy, so that's where I branched off into the tech side.
I love that. I'm going to make a little small adjustment here. There we go. Okay, so as far as maybe shows early on that impacted you, are there any that you remember, either ones that you were in or ones that you just went to see that really got you excited, maybe even specifically about tech theater?
Mm-hmm. So probably the earliest, and one of the shows that I was performing, it was an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And I played Mercutio, ended up, carrying a sword, and some of the technical aspects of having to care for the swords and be careful and do the fight choreography and that kind of stuff really got me fascinated with it. And then I was really lucky when I was a freshman in high school. There was an opportunity to go to New York on a summer trip. And so I worked my tail off, and I begged everybody in my family to hire me for odd jobs around the house, and paid my way to go to New York. And the day we landed in New York, we were all exhausted. We left early, but we did the New York thing, got some pizza, all of that, and then we went straight to see Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
And I remember watching that and seeing the chandelier come down, and just being from a small town, I had very little idea of what theater could be.
Yeah.
Especially on that scale. And so to see the technical elements in that was just mind blowing. And I'm one of those people that as soon as I saw it, I said, "How do they do that?"
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm going home and trying to figure it out. I'm just rolling it over in my head. How do they, trying to pull apart these different aspects of it. And I just really enjoyed that side of it.
That's really cool. I mean, that is something where I can really relate because I had a very similar experience with Phantom of the Opera actually too. I did a little bit of drama in high school, and then somehow got whisked away on this field trip where it was just the touring shows in Indianapolis. And I think we were probably in the nosebleeds, I think third tier up or something, but it still had that kind of an impact seeing and experiencing the spectacle of that show. I mean, it was one of the things that I think really drew my interest from the start too.
Yeah, it's seeing magic for the first time for me.
Yeah.
And just immediately being drawn to it and wanting to kind of chase that feeling.
Yeah.
Of the audience's reaction to this moment that people have created. I think it's magical.
Yeah, we'll talk about that, chasing the feeling. Like, what did that look like for you in your terms of your progression of getting into doing more tech theater?
Oh, okay. So when I got into college, I was hired in the scene shop, and that was something that was very exciting for me. I was learning all these new techniques, and trying to think of one of the shows we did. Oh my goodness, I'm so embarrassed that I've forgotten the name. Little Shop of Horrors,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously has the puppets and some of the mechanicals and that kind of thing. And there's in one of the music numbers, the phones are ringing off the hook, and they wanted to be able to time them to the music and that kind of stuff. And I said, well, I can figure out how to do that. So we had these actual vintage telephones that I'd never handled before and knew nothing about. And so I started wiring them up to my own little lighting boards with dimmers and that kind of stuff. And I remember there was, in one of the rehearsals, I was working on it on stage while the director was giving notes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm supposed to be very quiet and just minding my own business. And the whole company is out in the front row taking their notes. And so I'm off in the background, and I wire things up and I flip a switch, and it rings for probably half a second, and then just immediately is engulfed in flames. And that was one of my shining moments.
Yeah.
So there goes being subtle and being.
Yeah, right. I thought you were going to say it sounded really loud, but it actually burst into flames.
Yeah, just this tiny little vintage phone that I set on fire in front of the director and everybody. That
oh my gosh,
probably irreplaceable.
But of course, those are the things you remember, though.
Right. So after that, I started looking into some electrical safety and that kind of stuff.
You learned firsthand. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That was, I'm actually very fortunate that kind of reckless, go getter attitude that's all that it got me in the beginning.
Right.
I started being a little more careful and researching a little bit more before I started doing things that I wasn't sure about. So from there, after college, I worked with a children's show. They produced one episode a week. It was about 12 minutes long. It was actually with a large church in the Dallas area. Mm. And that was something that was fascinating. The writers wrote this science fiction kind of show, and which called for a lot of special effects and that kind of stuff. So it was more tinkering. I think the common thread for me is just, finding a creative solution to something. Mm. How do we make it work? And then unfortunately, a few years later was when I started saying, how do we make this work safely?
Right. Yeah. I love that. And, you and I were talking before about that, the kind of DIY, do it yourself, like having really creative ways to accomplish interesting things on stage, because in most environments that you're in, you don't have a lot of money.
Right.
So you're kind of trying to shoestring things together. And I mean, mainly today, I wanted to dig into some of that. I mean, it could just be like kind of digging into that treasure chest of things that you've stumbled into throughout the years, or maybe it's like fun tips about trying certain things. But I don't know, like maybe even as you think through some of the shows that you've done, mm-hmm. Are there some fun stories or even some examples of some of those do-it-yourself type projects that you've worked on that maybe could even lend themselves to some ideas for teachers or directors?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was in college, my wife, at that time, she was just a friend. We started a theater company that was a real small, like, sketch comedy group, and we traveled different places in the area. And we had our whole shtick was that we were the traveling trunk was the name of our show. And our entire show came out of one trunk. It was
oh wow,
4 feet long, 2 feet wide. I mean, it was small. It was large enough for us to stuff an actor into at one point. But everything we used, props, costumes, even scenery, came out of there. So we got really good at finding ways to make things collapsible and to make things small, but also to decide what is it that we really have to have.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get caught up in, the grandiose of the scene. What do we have to build? Well, we have to build an entire house. We have to build an entire kitchen and have the table and have the, all of the appliances. And doing that for us was a great exercise in finding what exactly do we have to have and what can the audience infer from that. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the magic.
Right.
A lot of times we would pull out something absurd that wasn't actually the prop that we needed, but the audience was willing to go there with us and say, okay, yeah, I see what you're doing there.
Yeah.
So that was really great. And then when we were in, let's see, when I was around 20 years old, we had a phenomenal opportunity. We were invited to a theater festival in Poland.
Mm.
And so we went, and obviously, well, not obviously, but I don't speak Polish. There were quite a few groups there for that. Their native language was something that I didn't speak, and they didn't speak English. So we had very little direct communication in terms of language. And we saw a show that had no dialogue. There were 2 musicians and 3 actors.
Mm.
And they built, basically out of bamboo and twine, this entire set. And they told a beautiful story about the daily life and the tedium of having a 9-to-5 job and getting stuck in traffic and all of these things that a lot of people relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite effects, I saw they had, there was a piece of twine strung across the front of the stage, and they'd taken clips and they'd clipped all of these little paper cutouts that they had used colored pencils to draw cars.
Mm.
And so they had all of these cars clipped to the line, and someone was pulling the string, and it was, eking across this traffic jam.
Yeah.
And that was I think that was a very influential moment for me too, to see the storytelling aspect. I believe that's something we talked about last time too, was the storytelling. Later after college, I ended up working at the Alley Theater, which is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of scenery and special effects, because they're so established. They've been around since the 40s. Mm-hmm. And they have a wonderful community support there in Houston, Texas. Mm-hmm. And they have great resources. They've taken, they've gone to great lengths to research and find all of the materials that they need and what they need to make things work.
Yeah.
And so at the Alley Theater, I was so excited I got to be a part of what they were doing. And that was when we got into hydraulic lifts and chain hoists and the big things. We had giant sets that flew into the air to reveal another set underneath, that sort of thing. And being able to be a part of the brainstorming of that was absolutely fantastic and even then on that scale, it's still kind of a DIY thing, because everyone gathers around the table and they say, this is what the designer wants. They've given us this house that has to, explode into several pieces and then come back together. And so, the TD, the master carpenter, but a few people in the shop, they all sit around the table and they draw it out on their, on the drawings, and sometimes just on the table if we're down in the shop, and say, okay, well, we would need something like this, and how do we do that with what we have? And it's still, regardless of the resources you have, it's a wonderful experience to be able to start it from the ground up, to see it go from a concept to the realization. And I love working with, TETA Summerfest. This was my first time presenting there. I'd never been to a conference, so I didn't really know kind of the atmosphere that was there.
Right.
And it was phenomenal for me to meet these teachers, because after the workshops, they would come up and they'd say, okay, this is what I'm doing. And this is, oh, you're working on this show too? Well, this is what I did. And they pull out their phone and they're swiping through and they say, my kids did this and we did that. And I think speaking to the DIY theater, I think that helps build community a lot of times.
Yeah.
It's a great opportunity for people to say, okay, you've got great ideas. I've got great ideas. Let's see how we can make this work.
Yeah. I think it really is such a necessity in something like theater, because especially when it comes to schools, I mean, teachers are not intentionally, but in some ways they can just sort of become their own islands, because they're so, involved in making the productions work and rehearsals. And there's so much that's required just to put on a show, that having the time to pull back and get ideas and share ideas and continue to develop in terms of the things that they're trying, it can be challenging to find that time. So I think that's why some of the workshops and conferences can be so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
was surprised when my wife is a theater teacher, and seeing the amount of responsibility that she has, all on her own shoulders. It's
Yeah.
so the first time that I really started digging in and seeing what she did for her day to day job was just mind blowing for me.
Yeah.
And then to ask around and to start to meet more teachers in the area, and they're saying, well, I've done all of this stuff, and I did it all on my own.
Right.
It's just incredible to see. So it is easy, like you said, to become an island. It's really difficult to sometimes reach out because if you're the only one in the room, it's real easy to stay that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is, I mean, it's so cool. I remember when you and I were talking, I was just fascinated by hearing some of the stories and some of the things that you have been able to do, and then be able to pass that knowledge along. I think is so important. Like you're saying, it's the spirit of theater. It's kind of what it's all about, right? Which is, gosh, we're not in it for ourselves. We're in it for educating. We're in it for the audience and what it can bring to them. So whenever you can have an opportunity to, just share the little things that you've discovered along the way, I think it's so cool.
Sure.
Um, what are some, I mean, as you kind of think even over some of the things that you've done recently, are there some like ideas that you've come across, like things that you've been able to go buy at a Home Depot, or things you've been able to rig up or put together kind of on the fly, probably out of necessity sometimes, that you could say, we were trying to create this really big effect, and here's the solution that we came to for the very things that you're saying, because we realized that we either didn't have the money or the time. And so we just had to suspend the audience's disbelief by doing this one little effect. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Oh yeah. The first thing for me would be for our during the drill teams, the Apache Bells. They have a spring show every year.
Mm,
It's their big spectacle. It's basically the conclusion of their season, and it's a great dance show. In one of the scenes, they said, okay, we want basically for them to be in shadow here, so we can see the silhouette of the dancer, and then the music changes, and so we want the silhouette to go away, and then we want all the other dancers to come out. And so I started explaining, like, hey, that sounds like a Kabuki Drop to me, where basically the
right.
whole curtain falls from the top and all at once. And they said that would be great, and we also want the curtains to go away really fast.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's it's a different kind of rig, and so we talked about it a little bit, and they said, well, we could probably rent that. Yeah. So I started looking around, and they said, well, how much is it going to cost? Because we have some money in the budget. We can probably make it work. And I said, well, how's a few $1,000s? Well, well, that doesn't quite fit in the budget. And so doing exactly what you said, I went to Home Depot. I actually got some conduit pipe and used some some nails that I had in the shop, and basically went back to the basics, because the rig that they were looking at renting was a pneumatic rig, and it had high speed winches to pull the curtains and all of this stuff, and it was basically automated. And I said, hey, they've been using this kind of effect for a very long time, so let's go back to that and look at the mechanics of how it was done simply and originally.
Yeah.
And often it was bamboo cane, and so we didn't use bamboo. We ended up using steel conduit. It was easier to hang and just easier to work with, and much more readily available
Yeah.
at Depot. So we used that, and we actually welded some nails into it, and then we went to the local Joann's and got some muslin.
Mm-hmm.
Basically made a simple drop, put some grommets in it, which was a great teaching experience to teach some
Right.
students how to do a grommet punch and that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
um, so we made the rig for, I believe it was under $100.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then we had one of our stage hands, dropped it, and had two more pull the curtains on the snatch lines, and it was beautiful.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I mean, I think that arrives at another question too, which is, I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm like, boy, wouldn't it be great to have a Bryce along for my production. And I'm sure for teachers, especially the ones that take your workshop and listen to you. And I mean, you not only have really creative ideas, but also just some of the chutzpah to go make it happen. And as a teacher, I know listening to that, you might go, gosh, if I could just have somebody like that in my organization, or access to somebody like that, what are some ways you encourage teachers who maybe, and I don't know if it's through delegating students or if it's through engaging volunteer members in their community. I mean, are there any things that you can advise teachers on who are looking for sort of a go-to person who they can lay out a vision for something, and then they might be able to offer up some patch it together, put it together type ideas to make something a reality?
Sure. Yeah. Well, everybody needs a fixer.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many resources. It's so easy, like we were talking about earlier, it's so easy to get caught up and I have to do all of this myself. And you really have to sit down and kind of say, okay, what are the things that only I can do? What are the things I can delegate to volunteers? And what are the things I should delegate to students? I know that a huge resource, especially in my area, for high school directors and sometimes middle school or junior high as well. A great resource is to go to the ag teachers or any of the teachers that teach trade courses. So the welding or any other kind of craftsmanship. I know that one of the theaters here in town, they have, their guy is an auto mechanic.
Yeah.
And he previously was an HVAC technician, and he also, he had lots of trades, and he ends up doing a lot of volunteer work. We even have someone here at TJC. His name is Glenn, and he's been around forever, for generations of students. And he's fantastic. He has a shop out on his place, and sometimes for special projects, we go, Glenn, we really need this thing, and it needs to work like this, and it's it's back to the napkin drawings. So there's always somebody who's willing to help. A lot of times people don't realize that all you have to do is engage somebody.
Yeah.
Whether it's somebody in the community, a lot of times it's great to ask for parent volunteers as a teacher.
Right.
I've always been surprised to see how many parents will show up and they have one little niche that they like to do. There's somebody, I love running errands. I love doing coffee runs. I love making sure that paperwork is done the right way, that kind of thing.
Right.
Same way, you'll find that a lot of times you have a team of parents or family members that say, hey, I've got a bunch of junk in my garage and let's see what we can put together. Yeah. I loved Back to the Future. I love to put stuff together. And I think that it's really important when you're looking for people like that to find what gets them excited. If they're the ones who like doing fundraisers or bake sales or whatever, then have them do that. Put them in charge of it. And if there's somebody who's a tinkerer or somebody who or is skilled at a craft and they want to volunteer or work for tickets or however you work it out, find what they're excited about and give them the resources to be a part of the team. That collaboration is so important. It's a lot of times it's easier for them and it's more enjoyable to feel like a part of the team and they get free tickets and come to the special events. It's more enjoyable for them to do that than it is to say, well, normally I'm so many dollars an hour and this is what the would cost. And I think that it's important to find people who have that drive. Right.
Well, let me make one more adjustment here, Bryce. Okay. The sun's right in my face. It happens this time of day from that window. Well, I have a very similar experience with that. We were working on a community production of Charlotte's Web, and we were going to do projections for it. And, just sort of as circumstance can happen sometimes, I was sitting at a table with a couple of parents, one of them who was just kind of a construction-minded dad. And we were talking about, well, we'd love to do rear projection. We'd love to, it was a small theater space. And so we were looking for ways to do it on the cheap, to do it for, under $100 if we could, to build a screen or something. Right. And, I basically just sat there and laid out the vision and then shut up. And for about 20 minutes, these two parents just worked out how to build a wood frame, how to get some construction plastic, and he had figured out how to create like a bicycle, like use a ratcheting system to tighten the plastic around the frame so that it would, you wouldn't see any of the folds. And it was beautiful. It worked beautifully. I mean, it looked like a professional setup when we were all done. And he had even built it in a way where it could be stored and then brought back out for other shows. And it's like you're saying, it's just engaging somebody, but then watching that unlock their creativity. Because I think there's a lot of people that when they think of creativity and they think of creative people, they probably wouldn't lump themselves into that category.
Right.
But then when they're presented with a problem and they see an in or something that they know or a way they can plug into it, then it just unlocks this whole other thing. And it not only makes for a wonderful show, but then it also gives them an experience which is so rich, where that's a whole nother aspect to the community of making theater too, right? Where that dad can see that show and look at that, and the story may be wonderful, but also there's a whole nother layer of I don't know, appreciation, or it just does so much for that person too, to be a part of that team.
Absolutely. We had a sponsor a few years ago with one of our dance shows. They had a number that was themed around barbecue. It was Texas. Can't have Texas without barbecue. And so we actually reached out to one of the local barbecue joints and said, hey, we want to build a miniature version of your barbecue stand on stage.
Yeah.
And that was something that they got really excited about, and they got really involved. And it was the same thing, because they have a big neon sign, and we said, well, we can't afford to make a neon sign. And so we got creative and found some LEDs and made this sign. And we said, hey, if you want to come see the show, bring any of your employees or anybody you want, just let us know how many tickets for each show you want.
Right.
And they ended up bringing, I think, 20 guests to each show, 4 or 5 performances. Wow. And some of those people are now much more active in what TJC is doing and what that department's doing. And and that comes back down to the audience. I mean, if we do the show because of the audience, I mean, among other things, but it's that community with the audience and that shared experience. And then I just think it's wonderful when you can bring other people from the community on board, especially those who, typically don't come into the theater or come to see any kind of performance art. And suddenly they're engaged because there's something they can relate to. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, if you're like a high school director, let's just take a high school director, for example, and you have an interest, because I can relate to this on the projections. And like a lot of times I'll have teachers come up to me and maybe they've seen Anastasia on Broadway, or they've seen something where they see some really cool things happening and they're really excited about it. And their next thing is, well, gosh, how do I make this work in my space? Because here are the challenges that I'm working with. Maybe I'm in a gymnatorium, or I'm trying to make it work with my obstacles. And I feel like it's doable, but I just need someone to like kind of take my hand and like basically put it in the hand of like someone who can really make this a reality. Sure. Is there, and I don't know if this is resources or if it's recommendations that you have for somebody who is interested in bringing some more dynamic effects to the stage, or they're looking to do some more interesting things with their scenic environment? Are there places you would point them to, or things you would point them to maybe give them a leg up to starting to incorporate more interesting things into their shows?
I would say be a student of the craft first and learn what you're looking at. For me and for you, a lot of times that comes naturally as saying, looking at something and saying, okay, how did they do that? How did they pick that apart? And I will say that despite what my high school and college professors said, YouTube is a viable source of information. One of the biggest things that I draw on is YouTube. because a
Yeah.
lot of these regional theaters now are putting up videos of the behind the scenes sort of things and saying, this is how we built it, come check out how cool this is.
Right.
And saying, now you've seen it from backstage, you've seen the gear that we use. Now come see it as an audience member.
Right.
And for me, it's basically the first step is finding out what kind of equipment you need and what resources you need, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I work with a few companies here locally that I call up all the time. That was one of the biggest things that I've learned in my current job is to get to know your vendors.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few in Tyler. There's not many theatrical vendors, so we go to Dallas for most of ours. But to call them up and be able to say, "Hey, John, I need some help. We're looking at this kind of project."
Right.
And there's sometimes that he says, we carry that kind of gear, and this is how we can do it. We've ended up actually getting some free rentals from a few of our lighting vendors, just because we were saying, hey, we're looking at this kind of show. We'd like to see what you have, and then they actually send us a package of gear, and they say try this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, often if they send us some samples, it's not long enough to run a show.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to give away their business for free. But I found that for me, it's several of our vendors in Dallas. I would say especially Gemini is one of the companies that I work with quite a bit. I call them up. I've got the rep on the speed dial in my office number. Yeah. Rose Brand is also a go-to. They have some great people there that can point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
Now, if you're wanting to build it on your own, that's when the internet comes in.
Yeah.
I've found several companies, especially now that that everything is so easily available. They can ship it to you and do web conferences and that kind of thing to train you on how to use their gear. Just a few years ago, we upgraded we have a ballet that we do every year, the Nutcracker.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty standard.
Yeah.
And so there's the big Christmas tree in the background. And we had a kind of a DIY, very small LED units for light bulbs on the Christmas tree. And we could make them twinkle, and they were fantastic. They were built in the 90s. They were the workhorse. They were beautiful.
Right.
But at the same time, it was time to upgrade. And so I found a company, I believe in California, that helped me set up a rig of LED lights that we could control from our light board. And now we do pixel mapping and all sorts of stuff like that.
Oh, that's cool.
And that was really just a product of me calling my vendors and saying, what do I need?
Yeah.
I can put this stuff together, but I need a little guidance.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such a good point. The idea of always being a student and always being able to look for an answer anywhere. I mean, I don't know who the professors were that were telling you that YouTube was a no-no, but that is just ridiculous because, I've been doing not just projection work, but special effects and stuff for years and years on the visual effects end, doing things. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to relearn green screen removal from like a 12-year-old kid who's teaching it on YouTube.
Right.
And there's no shame in that, because wherever you can find the answer. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember that there was a day when there may have been one resource on that thing, and maybe you had to go dig through the books in the library or in a bookstore to find the one book and the one page that commented on the thing you were trying to learn about. So that is one of the wonderful things about the internet, is that you can literally type in anything and at least find a starting place. It might not be the exact right answer. It may not teach me everything I need to know in After Effects to achieve that, but at least it gives me a path. Right. And it in some ways, a lot of times teaches me a simpler way to do something, because I love that point that you're bringing up about storytelling. I remember there was a project I was working on where we were doing so many visual effects shots that I had filled up my whiteboard. It was one of those where I filled up my whiteboard with the number of visual effects shots that I had to do. And I was like making the check marks for all the different passes of the process. And it got so heavy and so intense that I realized I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to get to the deadline when I need to, which was actually really good, because then I had to take a deep breath and go, okay, I know I wanted to do the shot that way, but the reality is it's not going to happen. So what is the story actually command in this scene? And I actually ended up finding a much better approach that was much simpler. It had less flair, but as it turned out, the way I wanted to do the effect was going to be probably too cheesy and over the top for the way that it actually could be achieved just with some of the stuff that I'd done in camera, you know?
Right.
So I love that when you run into a roadblock and you realize, no, it's actually really good that I got stopped here, because now I'm going to find something that's far more appropriate for the story that's being told on stage.
Right.
Than my artsy brain, which wants to do sometimes way too much.
Sure. And that's, that's always a challenge when you hit that point and you say, okay, we have to realistically look at it. Are we going to make it on time? Are we going to be able to do it safely? And, but that also offers some of the greatest opportunity.
Right.
I was helping my wife with a show last year. And when I say I'm helping my wife, she always says, I need your help to do this design work and help me come up with ideas for the scenery. And usually I sit in the room with her and say, okay, that's great. I mean, she's fantastic.
Yeah.
But we ended up we went one direction with the scenery and kind of played around with it. She said, it just isn't working. You can reach a point where you have to say, am I doing this out of stubbornness because I want that certain look, that certain effect, or am I serving the story?
Right.
Sometimes it comes down to just cutting a piece or to doing something much more simply. Some of my favorite moments in theater is when you have a single actor on stage under one light.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up with, especially if you have access to moving fixtures and you have color changers and all of this, and you say we have to use them all the time, and sometimes you don't need it.
Yeah, it reminds me
to the story.
Yeah, it does. It reminds me a little bit of a colleague of mine who worked in news for years and years, and he said he still remembers the day that the new effects showed up for their editing package. And of course, for the first week of news, he said they were throwing in every possible effect. And he said by 2 weeks in, they were back to cross dissolves and all of the things, because of course it was fun to play with those things, but they weren't necessarily appropriate for what they were trying to communicate, which is kind of what it all comes down to. Yeah. Well, I just had this idea as you were talking. I was thinking, what's a good way that we could create some bite-sized tips or things that would really maybe be helpful and kind of take like your depth of knowledge and condense it down into some pieces that could be easily digestible for teachers to try some things. So who knows, this could go terribly, but
okay.
What I was thinking is maybe I'll just name some effects and you can just like rattle off if you have any DIY or ways that you've accomplished those effects in maybe simpler ways than we would normally think. Okay.
Okay. Sure.
All right. Let's see how it goes.
Oh boy.
what about rain? Rain on stage.
Rain. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to defer and say, talk to your projections guy. Rain is one of the most problematic things. Just because water does what it wants to do.
Right.
But it's also one of the most fun and effective.
Yeah.
And so it depends on what kind of rain you want. I mean, one of the best ways to do it, if you have the capability, is to run a water hose from your sink and poke holes in it.
Yeah.
And put it wherever you want. And then, and then pay for a new floor once it's been, soaked and rotten.
Right.
And that comes down to a lot of moving parts of how do you catch the water, how do you get it back. But really, though, a garden hose with some holes poked in it is great. One of the best tricks that I've been a part of is rain on a window. That's not necessarily, if you're doing singing in the rain, that doesn't get you where you want to go.
Right.
But for some shows, doing rain on a window is just as easy as getting some tubing and some adapters. You can find them on Amazon very easily.
Yeah.
And using basically an aquarium pump or a fountain pump. It's just a matter of how do we move the water where we want it to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what do you do with it when it hits the stage to, I guess, channel it in a way that's not going to create a flood?
I would say use as much plastic as you can and build something into either the deck or into the scenery that's going to catch that water.
Mm.
Because water's going to do what it wants to do, and if your stage is on a rake, you're gonna soak the audience after a little bit.
Right.
So basically, you can cut a hole into the scenery somewhere, and I mean, you could even use Tupperware tubs. Just small things like that. A few years ago, we used some feeding troughs that we bought at the local Tractor Supply. And just put those on stage to catch water, and that actually worked really well.
Wow.
You can buy them just as cheap as you can make them sometimes.
Did they stay on stage, or were they on wheels, or how did you?
So we actually had some volunteer stage hands that came on just to carry those off after they were full of water.
Wow. Yeah.
So they
very strong stage hands.
Yes, that's right. I think they were getting extra credit.
That's got to be the bare minimum. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. We do a lot of that kind of work. Years ago when the school did Peter Pan, they offered I believe it was extra credit in one of their I think theater appreciation to 4 or 5 of the football players to do the flying effects.
Oh yeah.
And so those guys got to make up a pretty good grade just by being backstage and flying some of the actors.
Yeah, they probably got to work some different muscle groups too.
Yes, yeah. But yeah, rain on stage is it's one of the best effects, but it's also one of the most problematic. I would also suggest testing it on a smaller scale before you go big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you hear that time and time again.
Yeah.
What about fire?
Fire.
Not a fire, but
right.
maybe smaller effects where you need a torch burning or something that's going to give the look of fire.
Sure. So we've actually most theaters have done away with, like you said, fire on stage, and so some groups have come up with a really creative way of doing it. And I've seen them built. One of our professors built one. This was great. He basically just put a small fan, like a computer fan that you can buy for, I think, $5 or $6 at the hobby store, with some LED lights, and then cut some silk. And it ran off of a drill battery. One of the drills out of the scene shop, he wired it up to that. And then you have the silk basically that's kind of blowing like this, and little orange and yellow LED lights underneath it. And in our proscenium space, our closest audience member is probably 20 or 30 feet. And we've used that to great effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And very safe.
Yes, absolutely.
Comparatively, especially.
Yes. Yeah. When I was young and learning, we did a Beauty and the Beast. And I won't tell you where we did this, but we made up little clay pots and ran a copper wire across it. It had 110 voltage, just standard voltage from an outlet, running to it with a switch on it. And our RTD would go buy some black powder for muzzle loading your muskets, and he would put the powder in there with the copper wire laying across it, and then activate the electricity, flip the switch, and it would set off the explosion right there on stage by the actors. Yeah. And I will say it was some of the most fun I've had.
Yes.
And I will not approve people doing that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we've moved past that.
Right. I was going to ask about fog a little bit, because one of the things we talk about when I teach workshops on projections, we talk about projecting on fog. And so something that comes up quite a bit is building your own fog wall, which I've not done myself, but I've worked with groups that are doing that to project onto. And so I've heard the tales about putting the fog machine into some sort of a container, once again, a computer fan, blowing that through PVC piping, and then, having the fog drift down. Are there any tips or other ideas that you have when it comes to fog, either to project on or just to have on stage?
Sure. One of my favorite gags is the witch's brew. I mean, that's something that we've been doing for a long time. It's just dry ice and water.
Mm-hmm.
And that can create some very thick, very dense fog. And it also sinks to the floor.
Yeah.
So if you can source that up high and then allow that to fall naturally,
Right.
basically the same way using the PVC and things like that.
Yeah.
One thing that we've had a lot of good luck with is using a regular fogger,
Mm-hmm.
and then running basically PVC through a cooler, just a cooler like you take to the beach, drill holes on either side, put the PVC through it, and then fill the cooler with ice. And so
Right.
as the fog goes through, it chills it and drops it as well.
Oh, cool.
And then it's the same thing of finding the way to get the fog where you want it to go.
Right. A little bit like water. It sort of goes where it likes.
Yes. Yeah. We've used air ducts, just the silver ducting to pipe it where it wants to go, where you want it to go.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of like keeping a toddler in the corner of the room. I mean, once you take your hands off of it, it's got to do whatever.
Right. Well, are there some instances in plays that you've done where it turned out really well, and is there a technique that you use to really control the fog in that situation?
Oh, okay, yeah. The first one that comes to mind is we have a concert every fall around Halloween. It's a kids concert.
Mm-hmm.
So this is with our band. There's, I believe, 60 students in the band. And they do a lot of music from kids shows and Star Wars and Jurassic Park and all of the movies that the music from.
Yeah.
And one of the best effects we've had, he was on a podium that was elevated probably 4 or 5 inches.
Yeah.
And I hid a fog machine upstage of the performers, and then we ran just a single duct all the way down to his podium and ran it underneath. And so when we activated the fog, it would basically crawl down the hose and come out from under his podium.
Oh, yeah.
And we ended up using cardboard underneath. We would fold it up and tape it to kind of make these little alleys for the fog to go through, because we wanted it to come out in certain spots. And yeah, it's really, it goes back to experimenting. We've used cardboard. We've had dancers actually move the fog for a few of our dance shows. We would, instead of spraying the fog directly on stage, we would we would use low fog backstage.
Mm-hmm.
And as the dancers came on, they had long flowing costumes. And as they came on,
yeah.
they would drag their dresses through it. And so as they came on, the fog would roll in with them.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And then the lighting designer, of course, had a heyday with it, doing the side lighting through the fog with the dancers. And the great thing about fog is that, it's cheap to run, so you can play with it as much as you want.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. Well, maybe as a good way to end this, I was going to ask you for students, and they could be high school students, middle school students, or even older students, people who are just interested in theater and would love to get into doing some of the things that you're doing for the shows. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice or encouragement or anything that you'd say about that?
Yeah, well, I've heard that the best way to become a good writer is to read everything. It's to just be engaged in it, to enjoy it for what it is. It's easy to go to a show and pick it apart as if we're critics.
Right.
But to just go enjoy and participate in the magic of it.
Mm.
I will say, if you're going into technical theater, you should have a backstage handbook. You can go online, buy them used. But yeah, that's and also remember that the people who are already working in the places where you want to be are just people. Mm-hmm. I think that was a big hurdle for me to get over when I was younger, was to see these people as somehow elevated and almost not human because, he designed this show for Broadway. and or even, you know, on a smaller scale, and say, oh, they're the director of this show, you know, locally, and they
Right.
don't want to be bothered, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it's for me, the biggest thing that I would encourage people to do is to meet people, to introduce yourself and say, hey, you know, I enjoy this kind of stuff. What, you know, do you have any tips for me? Obviously, don't monopolize their time by telling them, you know, asking them for 45 minutes when you're standing in the line somewhere. But to meet people and ask them and say, hey, what was something for you that you think everybody should know?
Mm.
You know, what's, you know, who's got a book out, or what show really inspires you, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it, you know, theater always comes back to the people. It's the community. Aside from the Backstage Handbook, I don't have a whole lot of literature to point to. I do a lot of mine on the internet, but I will say that I've worked very hard to reach a point where I can call people up and say, you know, hey, what's going on? We were working on a renovation of our large theater, and one of the professors called up a projection designer in New York and was like, you know, hey, bud, what do we need to do for this?
Yeah.
And so my encouragement is to really go meet people, you know, actively seek out the people that are already doing it, learn from them. I think that's the most important thing to do.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. We should do this again.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I will do this anytime you want.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you bet.